The man about to die is a major in Hitler's army. He sprints across a stone courtyard slick with dust and shattered slate, boots scraping on 600-year-old steps as machine gun fire chews the walls around him. In the window ahead, an elderly Frenchman in a rumpled suit is frozen where he should never have stood, silhouetted perfectly for the snipers in the tree line. Major Joseph Sepp Gangl grabs the politician's sleeve and yanks hard, trying to drag him back from the light. The bullet finds Gangl instead. It hits with a flat crack that echoes off the castle walls. He folds without a sound, his weight slamming the Frenchman against the stone. Around them, plastered dust drifts through the air like smoke. Somewhere below, an American voice shouts for more ammunition. A German soldier, still in Wehrmacht field gray, drops to his knees beside the fallen major and stares, stunned, at the blood spreading across a uniform that was supposed to be on the other side. Gangl does not die for Hitler or for the Reich whose eagle is stamped on his buttons. He dies trying to save a man his army helped defeat 5 years earlier, one of France's former prime ministers. Outside, the roar of an American Sherman tank has gone silent, its hull blackened and still in the courtyard. On the ramparts above, men in mismatched uniforms fire from the same parapets. American GIs with M1 rifles, German artillerymen with Carabiner 98 KS, and Austrian partisans with scavenge pistols. Between them, in borrowed helmets and ill-fitting coats, a few French prisoners clutch rifles they barely know how to use. They are all shooting at the same enemy. Down in the woods, SS men in mottled camouflage blaze away with MG42s. The Hitler's buzzsaw sound rattling up the slope. Panzerfaust teams crawl from tree to tree, hunting for another shot at the castle gate. The black double lightning bolts on their collars mark them as the most feared troops of collapsing regime. Today, their targets include not only Americans and French hostages, but also Germans branded as traitors for turning their guns the wrong way. It is the 5th of May, 1945, in the Austrian Tyrol, just days before Germany surrenders, and the lines of World War II have shattered so completely that American soldiers and Wehrmacht officers are fighting and dying side by side. How did a war built on clear fronts, Allies versus Axis, end with this impossible scene? A medieval castle in the Alps where U.S. tankers, German defectors, Austrian resistance fighters, and French political prisoners hold the walls together against an SS assault? And why did a decorated officer of Hitler's army choose to spend his final minutes shielding a French statesman, instead of obeying the orders of the regime he'd served for years? To understand what brought these men to Castle Itter, to this strangest of last stands, you have to wind the clock back 5 years to the moment France fell and the first seeds of this unlikely alliance were planted. In June 1940, as German tanks rolled through Paris and the swastika rose over French ministries, a different kind of prisoner list began to form in Berlin. The men on it were not ordinary captives. They were the people who had run France in the decade before the war. Paul Reynaud, the prime minister who had refused to accept defeat. Edouard Daladier, the man who signed the Munich Agreement. Generals Maurice Gamelin and Maxime Weygand, successive commanders-in-chief of the French army. The trade union leader Léon Jouot, the tennis champion Jean Barotra, and Michel Clemenceau, son of the Tiger, of World War I. To Hitler, they were trophies and bargaining chips. To his security services, they were dangerous witnesses who might someday testify about what had been done to them. Over the next years, these French VIPs were shuttled like parcels between prisons and concentration camps. Buchenwald, Sachsenhausen, Itter's parent camp of Dachau. They traveled in sealed trains, past countryside they knew from peacetime tours and election campaigns, now glimpsed through barbed wire. By 1943, the SS had a special use in mind for an old stone fortress above a tiny Austrian village called Itter. Castle Itter, a medieval structure perched on a rocky outcrop near the town of Wurgl, was quietly converted into a Sonderlager, a special satellite of Dachau reserved for important French prisoners. Behind those thick walls, former prime ministers and generals found themselves sharing cramped rooms, their political feuds compressed into a few hundred square meters of courtyard and corridors. At meals, They argued bitterly over who had lost the war in 1940. Reynaud and Daladier revisited cabinet debates from 5 years earlier, while SS guards watched, amused from doorways. Life there was less brutal than in the death camps, but it was still prison. They were permitted short walks in the courtyard under guard, limited books, a little news filtered through German papers, and when they were lucky, a smuggled BBC broadcast. They knew almost nothing about their ultimate fate, only that the men guarding them wore the skull and crossbones insignia of the SS Totenkopf, the death head units that ran the concentration camp system. As the war turned against Germany, the mood inside the castle shifted. By late 1944 and early 1945, the distant thunder of Allied bombers became a regular backdrop. Guards returned from leave with tight faces and fewer illusions. Rumors seeped through the walls. Allied landings in Normandy, Soviet advances in the east, American tanks in the Ruhr. For the French prisoners, hope came mixed with a new, sharper fear. They had seen what the SS did when threatened. They knew massacres of prisoners were not hypothetical. They were standard procedure in a collapsing system that saw enemies everywhere. If Germany lost, what would become of a handful of high-value political captives in an isolated castle above a minor Tyrolean town? At the same time, the region around them was dissolving into chaos. In the Tyrol, Wehrmacht units retreated through valleys choked with refugees and wounded. Local Nazi officials still preached resistance to the last bullet. The SS organized demolition teams to blow bridges and rail lines rather than let them fall to the Americans. Austrian civilians looked nervously from one uniform to another, unsure which German would be in charge tomorrow, or whether there would be any Germans left at all. In Berlin, Hitler killed himself on April 30th, 1945. The news reached the Alps in fragments and whispers, carried by radio and rumor. At Castle Itter, it arrived as a mood before it arrived as a fact. The guards were suddenly more nervous, more jumpy, less interested in procedures they had enforced for years. Then, in the first days of May, the commandant and most of his SS detachment simply left. They packed what they could, burned papers they didn't want the Allies to read, and drove off in trucks and staff cars, heading deeper into the mountains or east towards zones where the Soviet advance had not yet arrived. A handful of lower-ranking men and civilian staff remained, but the hard core of the SS leadership was gone. For a few hours, the French prisoners tasted something like freedom. The outer gate was no longer watched by armed men who could kill them with impunity. They could move more freely inside the walls, talk openly, breathe. Then, reality caught up with them. They were in the middle of a war zone, without real guards, without a garrison, without a clear plan. Roaming SS units, angry, desperate, cut off from orders, were still moving through the Tyrol. To such units, a castle full of prominent French politicians and generals offered two temptations: hostages to bargain with, or enemies to massacre in revenge. The French VIPs understood that if the wrong patrol reached Itter before the Americans did, there would be no witnesses and no second chances. Some argued for barricading the castle, using the handful of weapons they could scrounge to hold out as long as possible. Others talked about escape, about slipping out individually or in small groups, and trusting to luck. All of them knew that doing nothing was no longer an option. The solution they came up with relied on the bravery of a man who was not French at all. Among the non-French prisoners assigned as orderlies and handymen at Castle Itter was a Yugoslav named Zvonimir Kakovic. He had no title, no seat at the prisoners' dinner debates, but he listened, watched, and understood perfectly what a visit from the SS would mean for everyone inside. When the chance came, Kakovic volunteered to do the one thing the French leaders could not: leave the castle, cross enemy-held territory on foot, and find the advancing American army. If he was caught, he would be shot as an escaped prisoner, and the men he was trying to save might die anyway. If he vanished into the mountains and never returned, no one in the castle would ever know what had happened to him. But if he succeeded, there was a chance, just a chance, that help could reach Castle Itter before the SS did. On an early May day in 1945, as the last of the senior SS staff drove away, Zvonimir Kukovic slipped out of the castle grounds and into the forest, carrying nothing but a hastily written appeal and the names of French statesmen that might persuade an American officer to listen. He did not know that in the town of Wurgel below, a German artillery major named Sepp Gangl was already quietly turning his guns away from Berlin. He did not know that ahead of the American lines, a rum-drinking tank captain named Jack Lee was about to hear the strangest rescue proposal of his war. All he knew was that time and distance now stood between Castle Itter and whatever fate the SS had in mind. For the prisoners at Castle Itter, Zvonimir Kukovic vanished into the trees and into uncertainty. The path he followed wound downhill through damp forest and across logging tracks, past farmhouses where curtains twitched at the sight of a stranger in prison clothes. He moved at night when he could, hid by day when he had to, skirting roads where Wehrmacht trucks still rattled past, their drivers staring straight ahead as if speed alone could outrun the war. He knew the Americans were somewhere to the west, pushing into Austria from Bavaria. He had no map, no compass, only scraps of rumor. Tanks near Innsbruck, jeeps in nearby valleys, stories from guards who had boasted for years and now spoke of retreat. Every bend in the road posed the same dilemma: stay in the open and risk being seen, or cut through the fields and risk getting lost. He chose the shadows, hugging hedgerows, sliding into ditches whenever he heard engines, waiting with his face in the mud while columns of gray-green uniforms trudged past above him. Somewhere behind him, the castle he'd left behind sat alone on its hill, housing more political history in a few stone rooms than many parliaments. Ahead of him, he hoped, were men in khaki and olive drab who might recognize names like Reynaud, Daladier, Gamelin, and understand what their deaths would mean. After a day or more of this exhausted navigation, sources differ on the exact route and timing, but not on his determination, Kukovic reached the edges of the American advance. The first U.S. soldiers he saw were not heroic silhouettes on a postcard, but tired men in muddy uniforms, busy directing traffic on a crowded road north of Innsbruck. They leveled rifles at him when he staggered from the tree-line, hands up, shouting broken German and French and whatever English words he could drag from memory. He told his story in bursts, breathless, gesturing toward the east. A castle, high on a hill, important French prisoners, guards gone, SS in the area, massacre if the Americans didn't move fast. At first, the Americans treated him as they had treated dozens of civilians and prisoners that week, with cautious skepticism. Everybody had a story. Everybody had a rumor about some hidden camp, some secret installation, some stash of Nazi gold. But when he started listing names, their faces changed. Paul Reynaud, Edouard Daladier, Generals Gamelin and Vagon, Léon Jouot, Jean Barotra. Even if the GIs didn't recognize every name, the officers did. These were not faceless prisoners. They were the people who would be needed to rebuild France, and the witnesses who could testify to what had been done to them. The Americans moved Kukovic up the chain, from checkpoint to staff tent to field headquarters, until his story reached a unit already at the sharp end of the advance into Austria, the 23rd Tank Battalion of the 12th Armored Division. Among its company commanders was a man whose temperament suited impossible missions, Captain John C. Jack Lee Jr. Lee was exactly the sort of officer the U.S. Army had learned to value in the armored war: aggressive, improvisational, restless in the rear. He was in his early 30s, with a tankman's deep squint and the manner of someone who had seen enough chaos to be comfortable inside it. By May 1945, he and his men had fought their way from France into Germany and now into Austria, part of a division that prided itself on speed and initiative. They had already seen the inside of German towns and German camps. They knew that every day of delay could mean more civilians dead, more prisoners executed, more evidence burned. When Kukovic's story was relayed to him, filtered through interpreters, stripped of some details, but still extraordinary, Lee understood two things immediately. First, if it was true, the political stakes were enormous. Saving a group of French statesmen and generals from the SS would matter far beyond the valley where it happened. It would be a gift to the future of Europe and a blow against a regime that was still killing people even as it died. Second, no one had ordered him to do anything about it. Lee could have waited for instructions, passed the problem up the chain of command, let staff officers weigh risk and reward. He knew how slowly information could move in the closing days of a vast war. He also knew what happened when decisions were delayed. So he did what men like him had been doing since North Africa. He decided to move first and explain later. Somewhere east of his position, in the town of Wurgel, another officer was wrestling with orders and conscience. Major Joseph Sepp Gangl had worn the Wehrmacht's field gray for the entire war. An artillery officer by training, he had served under the swastika from Poland to the Eastern Front and back, following orders, doing his duty, watching the early triumphs turn to retreats and rubble. By the spring of 1945, his war had narrowed to the valley around Wurgel, where he commanded elements of an artillery battalion whose guns had more often been turned into makeshift air defense or roadblocks than into instruments of decisive victory. The Reich he had sworn to serve was visibly coming apart. Hitler was dead. The front had moved past Wurgel in all but name. But for the civilians of Wurgel, the worst might still be ahead. SS units had begun using the town as a corridor for retreat. Local Nazi officials talked about destroying bridges and rail lines to slow the Americans, even if it meant leaving their own neighbors without food or escape routes. Rumors flickered that any sign of surrender, any white flag hung from a window, any attempt to negotiate, would be met with violent reprisals. Gangl watched this and understood that the war for him was no longer about distant front lines or maps on a general's wall. It was about whether he would use his rank and his guns to keep killing for a regime that had already lost or to protect the people who lived under its shadow. In early May, he made his choice. Quietly, he reached out to a group of local Austrians who had been waiting for a chance to act. Men like Alois Willy Mayer, who had long opposed the Nazis but kept their resistance limited to whispers and small acts of defiance. Together, they conspired not to hold Wurgel for Berlin, but to save it from Berlin's last defenders. Gangl placed his artillery and men in positions that made it clear the SS would not blow up Wurgel's vital bridges without a fight. He assured the townspeople that he would not allow demolitions in the heart of their homes. In effect, he defected in place, still wearing Wehrmacht insignia, still technically a German officer, but no longer obeying the will of the party or its security apparatus. On paper, that made him a traitor. In practice, it made him the only thing standing between Wurgel and the kind of pointless, end-of-war destruction that was already consuming other towns. It also made him exactly the sort of German officer the Americans would be willing to talk to, if they met him in time. The link between Castle Itter, Wurgel, and the approaching American tankers came from an unlikely source, an SS officer. Kurt Siegfried Schrader was an SS Hauptsturmführer, a captain who had been badly wounded on the Eastern Front and reassigned to safer duties in the Reich's interior. Through the labyrinth of SS bureaucracy, he had found himself in positions involving the security and oversight of special prisoners, including time connected to Castle Itter. Unlike the hardline ideologues who had run Dachau and its satellites, Schrader had spent long enough at the front to see what blind obedience to Hitler had cost. At Itter, he came into contact with French prisoners who spoke German, argued politics, and behaved less like caricatures of enemies than like complicated human beings. By the time the commandant fled and the senior SS staff abandoned Castle Itter, Schrader's loyalties had already begun to shift. He saw clearly what would happen if a roving SS unit reached the castle first. The French VIPs could be killed as hostages or counter-terrorists, and the last pages of their lives would vanish into a burning file cabinet. He could have left with his comrades, disappearing into the streams of retreating SS heading south and east. Instead, he decided to stay and to act. Working with the remaining skeleton staff and the prisoners themselves, Schrader maintained a semblance of order at the castle after the commandant's departure. He helped organize basic security and try to keep the more nervous guard from panicking. But he knew that without outside help, Itter was a death trap waiting to be sprung. So Schrader went down the hill. Accounts differ on the exact sequence, but the broad picture is this. An SS captain with doubts about his own organization visited Wurgel and made contact with Major Gangl and the Austrian resistance. He told them about the French VIPs on the hill, the absence of a real garrison, and the danger of an SS strike. For Gangl, it was a moment of moral clarity. Protecting French prisoners from his own countrymen was a step beyond protecting Austrian civilians from SS demolitions. But it was consistent with the decision he had already made. He agreed the castle had to be defended, and for that, he would need the Americans. The meeting between Jack Lee's advancing Americans and Sepp Gangl's newly rebellious Germans could easily have ended in blood. When American tanks and half-tracks reached the outskirts of Wurgel, they were on the lookout for ambushes, not allies. To the men in those vehicles, any German uniform was a potential threat. The division had fought through too many last stands and booby-trapped towns to assume that a white flag meant safety. Gangl knew that if he marched into their path in full Wehrmacht kit, he might be machine-gunned before he could utter a word. So he sent intermediaries first, Austrian civic leaders bearing improvised flags of truce, hands held high, stepping into the path of vehicles that could crush them without slowing. They carried a message. A German major in town wanted to surrender his men, protect the civilians, and cooperate against the SS. For Lee, or whichever officer first received that message, this was a new variation on an increasingly common theme. All across Germany and Austria in early May, isolated units were approaching American lines with offers to surrender, sometimes with pleas for protection against the SS or the Soviets. What made Wurgel different was its combination of local stakes and that extraordinary rumor carried by Kakavik, a castle nearby, full of French VIPs. Lee drove into Wurgel and met Gangl in person. We don't have a stenographic record of their first conversation. There is no transcript of the handshake between a U.S. tank officer whose division patch bore a snarling cat and a Wehrmacht major whose collar still carried the oak leaves of Hitler's army. But we know the essentials of what they agreed. Gangl explained the situation in Wurgel, the civilians, the bridges, the threat from SS demolition squads. He acknowledged his formal status as an enemy officer and made clear that, in everything but insignia, that status had changed. He also told Lee about Castle Itter, confirming the castle's location and the presence of high-value French prisoners. Whatever doubts Lee might have had about Kakavik's incredible story melted under this second testimony from a man who, until days ago, would have been directing artillery fire against him. Lee now had 3 overlapping missions in the same small valley. 1. Secure Wurgel, to keep his own advance route open and protect the civilians Gangl had sworn to defend. 2. Locate and, if possible, liberate the French VIPs at Castle Itter. 3. Do all of this with only the forces he had immediately at hand, because the rest of the U.S. Army was busy doing the same thing across hundreds of miles. The obvious solution would have been to wait, consolidate, request a larger force, and move once the situation was clearer. Lee chose the other solution. He and Gangl formed an improvised coalition on the spot. Some of Gangl's men, a dozen or so Wehrmacht soldiers, still in uniform but now clearly on the other side of the war, would join a small American detachment to move on the castle. Austrian resistance fighters would provide guides and local knowledge. Schrader, the disillusioned SS officer, would act as link to the prisoners, clarifying the castle's layout and the routes most likely to be used by any attacking SS. Lee ordered one of his Sherman tanks readied for a fast push. The tank, an M4 variant armed with a 75mm cannon and multiple machine guns, would serve as the expedition's mobile fortress, its rolling gun platform, its psychological spearhead. With it, and with a handful of infantry riding in or alongside it, he planned to reach Castle Itter, assess the situation, and hold the place until more help could arrive. It was not a cautious plan. It was a plan born of urgency and a certain audacity. On paper, he was advancing with a single tank and fewer than 20 American soldiers into an area where intact SS units were known to be operating. He was adding to his company a group of German soldiers whose loyalty to their new cause had been tested for only a few frantic days. He was betting that this coalition of convenience would hold together under fire. He was also betting that if he didn't move, the cost would be measured in the bodies of French politicians and German civilians, and that this, so close to the end of the war, was unacceptable. The road from Wurgel to Castle Itter twists upward through farmland and forest, a country lane more suited to horse-drawn wagons than to armored columns. As Lee's small force moved out, with the Sherman's engine growling and a truck carrying Gangel's men bouncing behind, they knew they were vulnerable. A single well-placed anti-tank gun, a barricade of felled trees covered by Panzerfaust teams, could turn their rescue mission into a doomed excursion. Some accounts describe how, as they advanced, elements of Lee's original, larger support force came under fire from stubborn SS pockets and had to peel away to deal with them, leaving the Sherman and its immediate entourage increasingly isolated. What matters for our story is what the French prisoners at Itter saw: an American tank appearing on the road below, climbing toward the castle like an apparition. For the men watching from the castle windows, Renaud, Gamelin, Vagon, Jouot, Barotra, Clemenceau, the sight must have been at once surreal and intensely real. For years, their only close contact with weapons had been in the hands of their captors. Now, at last, one of the guns pointed in the right direction. When Lee, Gangel, and a mixed detachment reached the castle, they passed through the same gate that had admitted SS trucks and prisoner transports. The emotional geometry of the place shifted in an instant. American tankers who had never voted in a French election found themselves face to face with men whose speeches and decisions had set Europe's course before they were old enough to drink. They shook hands, exchanged hurried greetings, tried clumsy French or English or German phrases to bridge the moment. For a brief time, the courtyard of Castle Itter felt less like a prison yard and more like the lobby of some strange, hastily convened congress. There was no time to savor it. Lee and Gangel walked the walls, looked at the fields and roads below, and saw what any competent officer would see: a stone strongpoint in a sea of enemy-contested territory, with no friendly units immediately behind them, and plenty of cover out there for anyone who wanted to attack. They took stock of their resources. One Sherman tank, whose armor could absorb rifle and machine gun fire, but not unlimited hits from Panzerfausts. Its 75mm main gun, with a limited supply of high-explosive shells, could knock out any light fortifications the SS might use against them. A small group of American infantrymen, trained, well-armed, but tired and far from their parent units. Roughly a dozen Wehrmacht soldiers under Gangel, combat-experienced but now effectively deserters, whose families and futures would depend on the decisions they made in the next few days. A cluster of Austrian resistance fighters, with local knowledge and a few weapons scrounged from black markets and lost depots. And inside the castle, perhaps the strangest part of their ad hoc order of battle: a handful of French prisoners, some young and fit like Barotra, others elderly and frail, who nonetheless insisted on being given rifles. The older men, their hands shaking from age and imprisonment, were not going to win any firefight on their own. But they remembered the German invasion of 1940. They remembered the humiliation of armistice and occupation. If this was to be their last day, many of them preferred to meet it armed, alongside men who had once been their enemies, rather than waiting unarmed in a cell for the SS to come and finish the war. For Lee, the practical challenge was simple: turn this unlikely mix of men into a coherent defense. He had the Sherman moved into a position where its gun could fire out over the main approaches while its hull and turret were somewhat shielded by the castle walls. The stone courtyard became, in effect, a gun pit for the tank. He assigned sectors of fire along the parapets, positions where American and German riflemen would lie side by side, looking down the hill for any movement in the tree line. Machine guns were set up in towers and behind crenellations, their arcs of fire overlapping to cover gaps. He worked out signals and basic coordination with Gangel, who would be responsible for which part of the perimeter, how they would communicate under fire without friendly fire mistakes. They had no time to build deep trust, but they had enough shared military experience to understand one thing: if they didn't trust each other now, they would all die. Inside, The French VIPs had their own debates. Some wanted to be at the walls, to prove to themselves as much as to anyone else that they were not merely baggage to be protected. Others argued that their duty was to survive, to be present at whatever post-war reckoning awaited France and Germany. They compromised as best they could. Younger and fitter men like Barotra and some staff officers took positions where their strength and reflexes could make a difference. The oldest and most frail stayed back from the line, ready to carry ammunition, tend to wounded, or simply bear witness. Night settled over Castle Itter with the unnerving quiet that often precedes violence. Down in the valley, a few lights marked Wurgel. The silhouettes of retreating columns moved along distant roads. Somewhere in the dark, SS officers were hearing their own reports. American tanks in the area, German troops refusing orders, French VIP prisoners no longer under solid SS control. For men whose identity and power came from their role as guardians of the Reich's ideological purity, this was intolerable. Traitors in Wehrmacht uniforms, a renegade SS officer, American GIs, and French politicians all in one place. Castle Itter must have looked like the perfect last target, the ideal opportunity to prove their loyalty in the war's dying days. In the castle, the defenders did what soldiers and prisoners have always done before a battle they know might kill them. They checked their weapons, counted their ammunition, tried to remember small rituals. Some prayed. Some wrote quick notes they had no idea how to deliver. Some sat together, sharing cigarettes and stories that, in any other context, would never have been told across such lines. An American tanker and a German artilleryman compare the way their instructors had taught them to estimate range. A French politician and an Austrian schoolteacher talked about the pre-war summers they had both spent in the same spa town, never knowing the other existed. It was the kind of night when history compresses into a few hours, decades of rivalries and ideologies reduced to the faces around a table, the trust in a handshake, the knowledge that when the firing started, everyone present would be depending on the same fragile human courage. Before dawn, sentries on the walls heard it. The distant clatter of truck engines, the crunch of boots in undergrowth, the metallic clink of heavy weapons being set up in the woods below. Shadowy figures moved among the trees, taking position. Now and then a match flared as someone lit a cigarette, then vanished quickly. The line between forest and field became, in the gray light, a shifting blur of branches and weapon barrels. The SS were coming. Lee and Gangel moved along the parapets one last time, checking positions, murmuring last-minute instructions. The Sherman's crew climbed into their steel box, each man taking his place in the cramped interior, the smell of oil and metal filling their lungs. In the courtyard, French prisoners looked up at the walls and listened to the sounds drawing closer. They had been powerless for years. Now, for the first time in that captivity, they would have a say in how this day ended. On the hill above Wurgel, in the final week of the European War, the strangest alliance of World War II waited for the first shots of a battle no one had ever planned for, and no one would ever forget. The first shots came thin and tentative, like someone tapping on the castle walls with metal fingertips. A single rifle crack from the tree line, then another from a slightly different angle. A burst of machine gun fire that stitched across the upper stones and sent splinters of rock humming through the air. On the ramparts, American and German sentries ducked instinctively, then rose to peer over the parapet. Between branches and smoke, they caught flashes of movement. Helmet rims, gun barrels, the brief white flicker of breath in the cold morning air. The SS were testing the range. Jackley shouted for his tank crew. The Sherman's engine coughed to life in the courtyard, the sound echoing in the enclosed space. The turret swung slowly toward the forest. Inside the hull, the crew worked by habit. Loader ramming an explosive shell into the breech, gunner squinting through his sight, commander calling out targets as he glimpsed muzzle flashes. When the 75mm gun fired, the entire castle seemed to jump. The shell arced down into the trees and detonated among the trunks, a deep, concussive boom that rolled back up the slope. For a moment, there was silence, as if both sides were recalibrating the reality of the fight. Then the battle began in earnest. From the woods and low farm buildings below, MG-42s opened up, their ferocious rate of fire turning the air into a continuous ripping sound. Bullets chewed the stone crenellations where defenders sheltered, showering them with chips of rock. The SS weren't close enough to storm the walls yet. Their goal was to pin the defenders down, probe for weakness, make the castle flinch. Lee Sherman answered again, this time firing at a farmhouse whose upper windows had just flashed with muzzle fire. The shell punched into the building and blew it apart in a bloom of dust and debris. One of the SS machine gun positions vanished in the collapse. On the parapets, the defenders settled into their grim work. American GIs, their helmets tilted low, fired M1 Garens in steady rhythm, using the distinctive ping of empty clips as unconscious metronomes. Beside them, Wehrmacht soldiers worked their bolt actions or squeezed the triggers of MP-40S, their fingers remembering drills learned on far-off training grounds long before anyone had imagined this kind of alliance. Austrian partisans, who had spent most of the war hiding their beliefs, now shouted target directions openly, pointing out flashes in the undergrowth, enemy groups slipping from tree to tree. Occasionally, a French prisoner, one of the younger, fitter men who had insisted on joining the defense, leaned out to take a shot, the unfamiliar weight of the rifle both alien and suddenly natural in his hands. For an hour or more, the pattern held. The SS pressed closer in fits and starts, using every fold in the ground, every ditch and outbuilding to cut the distance. The defenders answered with rifle and machine gun fire from above and heavy shells from the Sherman, which slammed into anything suspicious that might conceal an attacking squad. The castle's medieval builders had understood the value of height and thick walls. Against rifle fire and even machine guns, Itter was a hard target. But the men below carried weapons its builders had never imagined. Somewhere among the trees, a small SS team crawled forward with Panzerfaust slung over their shoulders. The simple tubes of sheet metal and explosives were crude compared to the Sherman's machinery, but they had one great advantage. At close range, their warheads could burn through the tank's armor as if it were cardboard. Waiting for an opening, they edged closer as the Sherman fired at more distant threats, its crew focused outward. When a moment came, it was over in seconds. A Panzerfaust operator popped up from behind a low stone wall within effective range, sighted quickly on the exposed flank of the tank, and squeezed the trigger. The weapon's backblast kicked up dirt, and Lee's behind him as the shaped charge leapt toward the castle courtyard. Inside the Sherman, there was no warning beyond a sudden flash and a sound like the sky cracking. The warhead struck armor already stressed by days of combat, and a fountain of molten metal and fragments tore into the hull. The tank lurched. Smoke billowed from the turret ring. The engine coughed and died. For a heartbeat, defenders on the walls thought the entire vehicle might explode. Instead, the hatches flew open. The crew scrambled out, blackened and coughing but alive, dropping to the courtyard floor and running for cover as bullets sparked around them. The Sherman was now a metal monument, still part cover, but no longer the castle's hammer. Its loss shifted the balance in an instant. Without the tank's high explosive shells to smash cover, the defenders had to rely entirely on small arms, firing down at an enemy now emboldened to move closer, skirting buildings and hedges the Sherman could no longer obliterate. Up on the walls, the volume of fire from the forest increased. SS officers, sensing the change, pushed their men harder. Closer to the castle, the distinctive whoosh of more Panzerfaust launching rose above the rattle of machine guns as attackers probed for a shot at the gate or vulnerable portions of the wall. Inside Itter, the sense of security the tank had provided evaporated like smoke. Paul Reynaud, Edouard Daladier, and the other French VIPs could hear the difference in the battle's tone. The heavy, spaced detonations of tank shells were gone, replaced by flatter, sharper explosions closer to the walls. Grenades, mortars, Panzerfaust impacts. Some of the older men, whose hands shook too much for prolonged shooting, moved to less exposed rooms as requested. Others hovered near stairwells and corridors, ready to carry messages or spare magazines when called. The distance between their political arguments and physical survival had collapsed to a few meters of stone. Major Sepp Gangl did what good officers always do when the situation deteriorates. He moved toward the danger. He crossed and recrossed the courtyard, shouted instructions to his own men in German and to the Americans in whatever shared words they had found. He pointed out new threat axes to Lee, suggested adjustments in positions along the wall, and, crucially, kept checking on the safety of the prisoners he had pledged to protect. At one point, under particularly heavy fire, he noticed that one of the French leaders, most likely Reynaud, according to several accounts, was in a room dangerously exposed to sniper fire. Whether the Frenchman had gone there to watch the battle or simply hadn't understood the risk, he was now framed in a window that had become a magnet for bullets. Gangl yelled for him to step back. The older man hesitated, perhaps disoriented by the noise, perhaps unwilling to turn away from the sight of this improbable defense. Without waiting, Gangl ran. He dashed across open stone into the line of fire that had already chipped grooves into the masonry. The sound of incoming rounds sharpened, whining and cracking around him. Reaching the exposed Frenchman, he grabbed his arm and pulled, trying to drag him toward the deeper shadow of the interior. The sniper who had been watching that window took the shot he had been waiting for. The bullet struck Gangl at head or neck height. He collapsed against the wall, then slid to the floor, his weight dragging the French politician down with him. Men nearby rushed to pull them both to safety, but it was too late for the German officer. In that moment, the war's moral geometry rewrote itself again. A Wehrmacht major lay dead, not in defense of the Führer or any line on a map, but because he had chosen, deliberately, to place his body between an SS bullet and a former enemy prime minister. For the Frenchman whose life he had saved, and for the Austrians who would later name streets after him, the meaning of that choice would resonate long after the guns around Itter fell silent. For now, there was no time to mourn. Lee and the remaining defenders were running out of ammunition. They had begun rationing bullets, telling men to fire only when they saw clear targets. Some positions on the walls were held by a single rifleman, trying to look like a squad by shifting from embrasure to embrasure. The SS below, unaware of the defenders' dwindling supplies but sensing that the tank was gone and one of the enemy's leaders had fallen, kept up the pressure. A few attackers probed closer to the gate, crawling forward until grenades thrown from the walls drove them back. It was at this point, when the defenders were still holding, but the curve of their strength was bending downward, that Jean Barotra stepped forward. Barotra had been one of France's great tennis stars before the war, a Wimbledon champion whose speed and stamina had thrilled crowds on grass courts. War and politics had landed him here, in a stone fortress in the Austrian Alps, reduced to prisoner number among other VIPs. Now, as he listened to the battle and watched men younger than he was die around him, Barotra decided that his legs might still be his country's best weapon. He offered to do something almost no one else could: leave the relative safety of the castle, slip through the tightening ring of SS, and run for help. There were American forces somewhere not far away. Everyone knew that. Kakavik had reached them. Wurgel was in Allied hands. But in military terms, nearby could still mean hours the defenders might not have. Barotra insisted. He had spent his life on courts where everything depended on timing, nerve, and the ability to see openings where others saw only angles. This was different, immeasurably higher stakes, but something in the calculus felt familiar. You commit, you trust your body, you move. Under covering fire from the walls, he chose a section of the outer barrier where the drop was manageable and the enemy line was thinnest. Using a rope or improvised line, he lowered himself down the stone face, clinging to cracks and projecting rocks, boots searching for purchase. For a few terrifying seconds, he hung exposed, a man in civilian clothes against pale stone, while bullets whined past. Then he reached the ground, slipped into a fold of the terrain, and began to run. He moved in bursts, sprinting across open patches, then diving into cover, crawling through ditches, then exploding up onto his feet again. Years of athletic discipline serve him well. Even under fire, he could read the land quickly, choosing paths that kept him out of the clear sight lines. Behind him, the battle continued. Ahead, every field and hedgerow concealed the possibility of a lone SS rifleman whose shot could end both his mission and the defender's final hope. Eventually, accounts differ on the exact path and timing. Barotra reached American units from the 36th Infantry Division's 142nd Infantry Regiment, already moving through the region as part of the broader advance. To the GIs who saw a haggard man in civilian clothing burst from the undergrowth, gasping in French and broken English about a castle under siege, the scene must have seemed as implausible as Kakovic's story had days before. But Barotra's urgency and the fragments of information he carried, French politicians by name, an American tank, German defectors, SS attackers, were impossible to ignore. Officers from the 142nd pieced the situation together quickly. Somewhere ahead, within a few hours' march, there was a German castle holding both Allied VIPs and an ad hoc American detachment, under attack from SS forces that had not yet gotten the message that the war was effectively over. They made a decision very much like the one Jack Lee had made earlier. They would go. A column of infantry and supporting armor formed up, weapons checked, radios crackling. Guided in part by Barotra's directions and in part by their own maps and local guides, they moved toward Castle Itter as fast as the narrow roads and tactical caution allowed. Back on the hill, the defenders clung to their positions. Some had been awake for more than a day. Their shoulders ached from the constant recoil of their rifles. Their ears rang from explosions and the insistent buzz of MG42 fire. Between bursts, they could hear the faint, chilling sounds of SS voices shouting to each other below, closer now than they had been at dawn. The defenders didn't know that help was on the way. They knew only that their ammunition boxes were almost empty, that one of their key leaders lay dead in a corridor, and that the SS had not yet broken off the attack. For many, the horizon of their world had shrunk to the next magazine, the next target, the next 30 seconds of staying alive. Then, from the valley behind the SS positions, came a new sound, the distant thump of artillery, the chatter of American machine guns, the crack of rifles firing from an unexpected direction. At first, the defenders on the walls thought they might be hearing echoes of their own battle. But the pattern was wrong. The fire was coming from behind the attackers, not from the castle. The 142nd Infantry Regiment had arrived. Caught between the castle and fresh American forces in their rear, the SS suddenly found themselves in the position they had spent years putting others in. The same terrain that had allowed them to creep close now funneled them into kill zones from two sides. Some tried to stand and fight, turning their weapons toward the new threat, only to be cut down by experienced infantry who had fought from Italy to Germany. Others attempted to withdraw into the woods, only to run into flanking fire. A few, realizing the hopelessness of their position and perhaps the futility of dying in a war already lost, threw down their arms and surrendered. From the walls of Castle Itter, the defenders watched the SS line disintegrate. Where moments before there had been coordinated fire and steady pressure, now there was chaos. Men running, some with hands up, some stumbling, some simply disappearing into the trees. Slowly, cautiously, Lee and the others eased off their own fire. The volume of incoming rounds dwindled, then stopped. The silence that followed was jagged, broken only by distant shouts and the occasional crack of a last shot as pockets of resistance were cleared. When American soldiers from the 142nd finally reached the castle gate, they entered not as conquerors, but as reinforcements arriving at a position that had, improbably, held. Inside the courtyard, they found a scene that would have baffled any staff officer reading about it on a clean map. An American Sherman tank sat blackened and still, its crew now among the riflemen on the walls. Wehrmacht soldiers in field gray shared cigarettes with US GIs. Austrian civilians, some still in their work clothes, leaned against the stones, rifles slung over their shoulders. And bustling among them, exhausted but alive, were some of the most important men in pre-war France. Reynaud, Daladier, Gamelin, Weygand, Jouot, Barotra, Clemenceau. For the first time in years, they were not under the sole control of their captors. They were surrounded by allies and by Germans who had chosen, in the last days of the war, to act more like allies than enemies. The casualty count at Itter was small by the brutal standards of the Second World War. Major Gangel was the only defender killed outright. Several Americans and Germans were wounded. On the attacking side, dozens of SS lay dead in the fields and among the trees. Dozens more were rounded up and marched away as prisoners. But the numbers tell only part of the story. In the days that followed, the French VIPs were evacuated from Castle Itter, first to rear areas for medical checks and debriefings, then eventually back toward a France struggling to redefine itself after occupation, collaboration, and resistance. Some would return to politics. Others would become voices in the post-war reckoning, their testimony shaped in part by the memory of a German officer who had died in a castle corridor for them. Jacques Lee's actions at Itter were formally recognized by his own army. He received the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest American award for valor, for leading a tiny, improvised force into an unknown situation, holding it against a determined enemy, and refusing to abandon the prisoners he had been told about by a stranger. For Joseph Sepp Gangel, there were no decorations from the Reich he had betrayed in its final week. Instead, his honor came from the people he had decided to protect. In Wurgel and nearby towns, Austrians remembered the man who had turned his guns away from pointless destruction and his body toward the defense of civilians and prisoners. Streets would be named after him. Plaques would call him a hero of the resistance, an unusual epitaph for a Wehrmacht major. Kurt Siegfried Schrader, the wounded SS officer who had sided with his former prisoners, survived the war, his role in the battle less celebrated but no less significant in its moral implications. Even within the SS, in those collapsing days, conscience could occasionally override indoctrination. For decades, the Battle of Castle Itter remained what it had been on the day it was fought, a curious, marginal episode in a war of giants. It appeared in divisional histories and local Austrian chronicles, in a few French memoirs and scattered U.S. reports. Most people who had not served in the units involved never heard of it. Only later, as historians and writers began to look beyond the big operations and headline battles, did Castle Itter emerge into wider view. An odd, almost unbelievable story of Americans and Germans fighting together, French prisoners arming themselves, SS troops attacking their own countrymen. It is often described as the only battle of World War II in which U.S. troops and Wehrmacht soldiers fought side by side as allies against the SS. Strictly speaking, that's an overstatement. There were other late-war incidents of localized cooperation against fanatics or to protect civilians. But Castle Itter stands out for the clarity of its documentation, the prominence of its prisoners, and the starkness of its choices. It shows a Germany so fractured in May 1945 that enemy and ally had become less about uniforms and more about decisions. In the same valley, under the same flag, one group of Germans chose to kill surrendered prisoners and blow up bridges. Another chose to risk execution by their own side to prevent that. It reminds us that the categories we use to understand war, Allies, Axis, Wehrmacht, SS, are abstractions mapped onto millions of individual lives. Most Wehrmacht units did not mutiny in defense of their enemies. Most SS officers did not decide to protect the people they had guarded. Castle Itter is remarkable precisely because it was not typical. Yet, in its very improbability, it reveals something important about how wars end. When regimes collapse, when the myths that held them together evaporate, people are forced to decide what they actually believe in. For some, the answer is obedience to the bitter end. For others, it is self-preservation at any cost. And for a few, like Gangel, Schrader, Lee, Kukovic, Barotra, and the unnamed men on those ramparts, the answer is a form of moral courage that refuses to be bound by the uniforms they happen to be wearing. On a hill above Wurgel, in a castle that had once been just another on an SS administrator's map, that courage took the form of shared risk. Americans and Germans and Austrians and Frenchmen passing ammunition along the same walls, looking out toward the same enemy, knowing that if the SS broke through, they would all die together. The Battle of Castle Itter did not change the outcome of World War II. Germany would surrender within days, whether or not a single tank had reached that Austrian hill. But the choices made there, the decision to believe a Yugoslav prisoner, the decision of a Wehrmacht major to defy his orders, the decision of an American captain to drive into danger for men he had never met, add texture and depth to how we understand that war. They tell us that even in a conflict defined by vast, impersonal forces, individuals could still redraw the lines around them. That sometimes, on the very brink of defeat or victory, the most important question is not who you're supposed to be fighting, but who you choose to stand beside when the shooting starts. At Castle Itter, on May 5th, 1945, the answer to that question turned enemies into allies, a prison into a fortress, and a forgotten hillside into one of the strangest and most revealing last stands of World War II.